The party had the quality of all parties of its kind, which was the quality of a space in which money had been spent specifically to make the spending of it invisible, to produce an environment that looked like ease when it was actually effort, like natural abundance when it was actually curation. The Harrington house in the hills above the city was the kind of house that had been photographed many times for many publications, and that had the particular self-consciousness of spaces that knew they were looked at, and the people in it had the particular quality of people who had been photographed in spaces like this often enough to have internalized the performance of belonging. The bartenders wore white. The floral arrangements were single species, white. The lighting had been designed by someone who understood that the most flattering light was the light that appeared to have arrived by accident. Gideon Slate had been to this house before, and had been to many houses that were different versions of this house, and he occupied spaces like this in the way that he occupied all spaces, which was with the particular authority of someone who did not need the space to tell him he belonged in it, because he had already told himself. He was near the east windows when it happened, talking to two people about something he had already largely processed and was continuing to discuss out of courtesy, the specific kind of courtesy that was not warmth but the operational maintenance of the social contract. The windows looked out at the city below, and the city was doing what cities did from a sufficient height, which was look organized and coherent, and he was looking at it without looking at it, in the way that he looked at things that were present but not immediately relevant. He became aware of her in the way that he became aware of most things in spaces like this, which was peripherally and without particular attention, a figure at the edge of his field of vision, that his brain registered and filed in the category of things that were present and were not the focus. What moved her from that category to a different one was something he could not have named precisely, a quality of how she stood, or where she stood, or what she was looking at, some combination of those things that registered as wrong, in the same way that a door slightly ajar registered as wrong in a building where all doors were supposed to be closed. Not alarming but incorrect, a deviation from the expected pattern that the pattern-reading part of his brain flagged without being asked to. She was standing near the corridor that led to the private wing of the house. This was the reason. The space near that corridor was not a social space. It was not where conversations were supposed to happen. It was the border of the area that the party occupied, and the area that the party was not supposed to occupy, and she was at that border in a way that did not read as accidental. The way that a person who was uncertain of the territory tended to drift to its edges while they oriented, and the uncertainty was itself the problem, because the people who belonged at this kind of party did not drift to edges while they oriented. They entered and established themselves, and the space rearranged around them. The two people he was talking to were still talking. He was aware of them in the same peripheral way he was now aware of most of the room, which was the way that people who spent a great deal of time in rooms reading the rooms experienced the room when something in it had attracted the foreground of their attention. He said something brief and appropriate to the two people, something that indicated he needed to address something without specifying what. The kind of exit from a conversation that professional people in social settings performed and recognized in each other, and he moved toward the corridor. The decision had already been made before he reached her. This was the thing he would understand later, that the decision had been made in the moving, that the part of his brain, which had been reading spaces and bodies in spaces for 15 years, and had never yet been wrong, had already concluded, and was acting on the conclusion, while the rest of him was catching up. She was standing at the edge of the corridor, with a glass of something she was not drinking, looking at something in the private wing, and his hand moved before the rest of the decision arrived. The sound was the kind of sound that cut through ambient noise in a particular way, the way a dropped glass cut through it, sharp and specific, and capable of reorganizing the acoustic landscape of a room in the half-second after it occurred. He had not thought about the sound in advance. He had not thought about much in advance. The 15 years of pattern reading had operated without his deliberate participation, and had operated incorrectly, and the incorrectness was now in the air of the room, physical and irreversible, in the specific way of things done in public that could not be taken back, because there was no version of the next moment in which the room would not remember what had just happened in it. He was looking at his hand. She was in front of him. He did not look at her immediately, which was the second wrong decision of the evening, the first being the action itself, but the looking at the hand was not a choice but an instinct, the specific instinct of a person confronting the fact that their body had done something that their mind had not fully authorized, and the looking at the hand was the physical expression of the moment in which the mind caught up with the body and found what the body had done. His hand was the hand it had always been. There was nothing different about it. He had not left anything of himself on her, and she had not left anything of herself on him. And the hand was ordinary, and the hand had just done something that was not ordinary, and the two things existed in the room simultaneously, in the way that incompatible realities existed in the same room, which was badly. He looked at her then. She was standing. She had not moved. He had understood, in the abstract, that she would either move backward or forward or to the side, would produce some physical response to what had happened, because physical responses to things done to bodies were how bodies functioned, and she had not produced one. She was standing in exactly the position she had been standing in before, which was not the absence of a response but the presence of one, the presence of a decision that had been made in the time it took to receive the thing and decide what to do with it. And the decision was to be exactly where she already was, and the decision had been made faster than he had ever seen a decision made in a room under pressure. And he had spent 15 years in rooms under pressure. She was looking at him, not at his hand and not at the room and not at the corridor behind her and not at any of the many things in the room that were available to be looked at him, with an expression that he did not have a category for, which was itself remarkable, because he had categories for most expressions he encountered in most rooms, had built them up over 15 years of reading people, and had found them sufficient for the reading, and this expression did not fit into any of them, and he stood in the gap between the expression and his categories for it, and the room was in the process of becoming very quiet around him. The quiet was not the quiet of a room in which no one was making noise. The room was still producing noise, the ambient sound of many people in a large space. The quiet was the specific quiet of a room in which everyone was simultaneously aware of the same thing while performing unawareness of it, the specific human phenomenon of collective witness managed through collective pretense, and the collective pretense was thin, and everyone knew it was thin, and everyone was maintaining it anyway, because the alternative, which was acknowledging the thing that had happened, was something that no one in the room, including the people most directly involved, was prepared to do in the next several seconds. 8 seconds. He counted them later, in the way that he counted things that had been significant and that he needed to understand. 8 seconds of standing in front of each other with the ambient noise of the party and the thin pretense of the room between them and around them. 8 seconds in which she did not move and he did not move, and the expression on her face did not change. 8 seconds in which the only thing that changed in the room was the quality of the silence underlying the sound, which deepened incrementally in the way that silence deepened when the people maintaining it were putting increasing effort into the maintenance. And then she turned, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone removing themselves from an unbearable situation, at the pace of someone who had decided that the situation had yielded what it was going to yield, and who was now moving on to the next thing in the day's sequence. She did not look back. She did not say anything. She moved through the room with the particular quality of movement that belonged to people who understood how to cross a space without asking the space's permission, and the people in her path adjusted without being asked because people adjusted for people who moved that way. And in approximately 40 seconds, she was no longer in the room. He was still standing where he had been standing. He was aware of this in the way that a person was aware of their own body when the body had done something that the mind was still processing, the awareness of a person who was not in full communication with themselves, because the channels between the mind and the body were occupied with the processing of an event that was larger than the channel's current capacity. The two people he had been talking to were no longer near him. The room had reorganized around the event and around him, and the reorganization looked from the outside like nothing except what it was, which was a room of people maintaining the pretense of continuing their evening while simultaneously cataloguing everything they had seen. He looked at the place she had been standing. She had been talking to Thomas Reeve before the encounter. He had seen this in the peripheral register, had seen her next to Thomas, and had registered Thomas and not her, and then had registered her and not processed the implication of the adjacency. He looked at Thomas Reeve now, who was across the room, and was looking at the carpet with the careful absorption of someone who had decided that the carpet was very interesting and would be remaining so for the foreseeable future. The particular calculation that Slate's brain was currently running had the quality of calculations that began with incomplete information and were attempting to determine the dimensions of the error before they had access to all the relevant data. He was running the calculation on the basis of what he had. She had been talking to Thomas Reeve. She had been standing at the border of the private wing of the house. She had been wearing clothes that were not the clothes of this party, not because they were wrong in quality, but because they were wrong in intention, which was to say they were clothes that had not been selected for this room specifically. And she had stood for 8 seconds after what had happened and had not moved and had not changed expression and had looked at him with an expression he did not have a category for. These were the things he had. The calculation he was running with them was not producing a comfortable result. He looked at Thomas Reeve, who was still looking at the carpet. He looked at the place where she had been standing. He looked at the city through the east windows, which was still organized and coherent and did not know what had just happened in the room above it. He looked at his hand. He found Thomas Reeve in the same position he had left him, which was looking at the carpet with the studied absorption of someone who had decided that their role in the evening was now passive, who had concluded that the best contribution they could make to the current situation was to be invisible, and who was implementing invisibility through the specific technique of refusing to make eye contact with anything that might return it. Slate crossed the room without announcing his approach and stood beside Thomas Reeve and looked at the side of Thomas Reeve's face until Thomas Reeve, who was not actually invisible and knew he was not actually invisible and was simply operating under the pretense of it, turned to look at him. He asked the question that was the question he needed answered, which was not a complicated question but that had the character of questions whose answers changed the size of the situation they were being asked in, and he asked it quietly and without the inflection of urgency, because urgency would have given Thomas Reeve the option of performing uncertainty about what he was asking, and he did not want Thomas Reeve to have that option.
Who is she?
Thomas Reeve looked at him for a moment with the look of a man deciding how to deliver information he would have preferred not to have to deliver. The decision did not take long, because Thomas Reeve had been in the financial world for 30 years and had developed an accurate sense of when information was going to arrive at its destination, regardless of whether the person who had it chose to deliver it, and this was one of those cases. And the person asking was not someone whose requests Thomas Reeve had any historical precedent for declining. He said two words that were a first name and a last name, and the last name was a name that people in rooms like this one said with the specific intonation that they saved for names that were not people but institutions, not individuals but entities, not persons but categories of economic reality.
Anna Reeve.
Slate stood with those two words for a moment that had the character of the 8 seconds in the middle of the room, which was the character of a moment in which the brain was receiving information and integrating it into a picture that was significantly larger than the picture it had been working with, and the integration required time that was not quite as much time as it felt like, but was more time than the situation was comfortable with. He did not say anything to Thomas Reeve after the two words. He did not need to. He turned and walked back through the party, which was still occurring around him in the way that the party had been occurring around him all evening, which was to say it was doing what parties did without his participation, and he walked through it and out the east door and into the early October night, which was doing what early October nights did in this part of the city, which was be cool and clear and indifferent to what was happening in the houses above it. He sat in the back of his car for a long time before he told the driver where to go. She had been in the car for approximately 30 minutes before he sat in his car in front of the Harrington house. This was a fact he did not know at the time and would learn later, which was one of the things he would learn later that he would wish he had known sooner, not because it would have changed what had happened, but because the sequence of the knowing mattered. The car she sat in was not a car of the kind that attended parties in the hills above the city, which was part of how she had planned the evening. The car was a car that was not unremarkable, but whose remarkableness was unremarkable to anyone looking at it from the outside, which was a distinction that she had been drawing since she was 16 years old, and had understood that the experience of moving through the world without being read first was an experience that required specific preparation. The preparation included the car, the clothes she had been wearing, the absence of the specific markers that would have placed her in a category recognizable to the people in the room she had just left. She had taken the preparation off in the elevator of the Harrington building going up, had become temporarily and deliberately invisible in the way that the preparation allowed, and she had entered the room as the version of herself that was a person rather than a name. She was looking at her hand in the car, not because her hand was injured, which it was not, but because the hand was an easy thing to look at in the car, when she was doing what she always did in the period immediately after an event that had produced a significant response in her, which was to not process the response until she was in a space in which the processing was safe, which was a space where no one was watching the processing happen. The response was there, had been there since the half-second after the sound, and she was doing what she had learned to do with it, which was to hold it at a specific distance until the car was moving through streets that were ordinary streets. Streets that did not have the specific quality of the Harrington neighborhood, streets that had people walking their dogs and looking at their phones and doing the evening things of people who were not in the process of being the person she had just been in that room. When the streets were ordinary enough, she let the response in. It arrived the way things arrived when they had been held at a distance and were finally permitted to arrive, which was fully and without the orderly sequence that intellectual processing imposed, all of it, at once, the specific physical fact of what had happened, and the specific emotional fact of what had happened, and the specific cognitive fact of what had happened, all occupying the same moment rather than the succession of moments that the organized mind preferred. She was in the response for approximately 4 minutes, which she knew because she had learned to track these periods the way she tracked other important things, and then the response was processed, and she was in the next period, which was the period in which the event was a fact rather than an ongoing experience. And in the fact period, she could think clearly. In the fact period, she thought about 8 seconds, and about what she had decided in 8 seconds, and about whether the decision she had made in 8 seconds was the right decision. The decision she had made in 8 seconds was not to move and not to speak, which was not the decision that most people made when confronted with an event of that kind in a room full of people, and the not moving and not speaking was not the absence of a decision but the presence of one, the presence of a decision that had been made by the part of her that had been reading rooms and the people in them since she was very young, and that had been operating in this instance with the particular clarity of a person who understood a situation fully and was therefore in a position to choose her response rather than simply produce one. She had understood the situation fully because she had known who Gideon Slate was before she had entered the room. She had known who he was, had known the shape of his organization and the shape of the decisions he made, and the shape of his relationship to the spaces he occupied, had built this knowledge over 3 weeks of the careful and specific kind of attention that her father's organization brought to everything it considered. Because what her father's organization was currently considering was whether the entanglement of Reeve holdings in certain financial structures that were adjacent to Gideon Slate's organization was an entanglement that Reeve, Holdings wished to continue. The review had been ongoing for 3 weeks before the evening of the Harrington party. The Harrington party had not been on her calendar as a place where she would encounter Gideon Slate. It had been on her calendar as a place where she would encounter Thomas Reeve, who had been her father's contact at a specific level of the financial structure for 11 years, and who had information that she needed for the review that was not available through the formal channels the review was using. Thomas Reeve was the reason she had dressed as she had dressed and arrived as she had arrived, which was without the markers that would have placed her in the category of David Reeve's daughter at a party where David Reeve's daughter appearing would have reorganized every conversation in the room, and the reorganizing of every conversation in the room was not what the conversation with Thomas Reeve needed. It needed the ordinary version, the version that was just a person at a party asking another person at a party about things that two people at a party might reasonably discuss. She had not planned to encounter Gideon Slate at all. The encounter had found her, and the encounter, now that it was in the fact period and she could think about it clearly, had given her significantly more information about Gideon Slate than 3 weeks of document review had produced, more information than the conversation with Thomas Reeve would have produced, more information than almost any other encounter she could have arranged, because the encounter had shown her something about how Gideon Slate operated that no document captured, which was how he operated when his pattern reading failed him, when his assessment of a situation was wrong and he had already acted on the wrong assessment and the action was irreversible and he was standing in the room with the irreversibility of it. She had read what she read in 8 seconds, and she had made her decision in 8 seconds, and the decision was that the most significant thing she could do with the next 40 seconds was not give him the story he was equipped to manage. Every story he was equipped to manage had a woman who reacted in the way women in that situation reacted, and any version of her reacting in those ways was a version of the story that he knew how to handle, that he had protocols for, that he would move through with the efficiency of someone who had handled situations of that kind before. The version of the story in which she did not react and did not move and did not look away was not a version he had protocols for, and the absence of protocols was information, and information was what she was at the Harrington house to collect. She looked out the window at the ordinary streets and thought about Gideon Slate standing in a room looking at his hand, and she thought about the 3 weeks of review and the decision that the review was moving toward, and she thought about what the 8 seconds had added to the information she had and what it meant for the decision, and the thinking was precise and organized, and took approximately 11 minutes, and at the end of the 11 minutes the thinking was done. And what remained was not uncertainty, but the specific quality of certainty that arrived when a significant amount of information had been properly organized, and the organization had produced a clear picture. The car arrived at her building. She got out. The building was not the building that the name Anna Reeve was associated with, which was intentional in the same way that the car and the clothes had been intentional. The same preparation applied to the same purpose. She went upstairs and made tea and sat at the table in the kitchen of the apartment that was hers in the way that the building was not hers in the obvious sense, which was the way that mattered, and she held the tea and looked at the table and thought about nothing for the first time in approximately 4 hours, which was what she did at the end of the days that required the most of her, which was to not think for a specific and bounded period before the next day began. In the morning, she would make a call, not to Slate and not to Thomas Reeve, and not to anyone connected to the Harrington party. To her father's legal team, to update the documentation that the review had been producing, to add to it the notes she would write in the morning about what she had observed and what she had concluded and what the next steps of the review would be. The notes would be precise, and they would not mention the sound or the 8 seconds or the expression she had read on Gideon Slate's face when he looked up from his hand and found her still standing in the same place. Those things were not in the category of information that went into review documentation. They were in the category of information she held alone, the category that had always been, in her experience, the most important one. The morning after was a Friday. which meant it had the specific quality of Fridays, which was the quality of a day that was both ordinary and the end of something. And the end of something quality gave the morning a texture that was different from the texture of midweek mornings. A texture of things being assessed and summarized and filed before the pause that followed. Slate was at his desk by 6, which was an hour earlier than his usual arrival, which was itself earlier than most people's usual arrival, and the being at his desk at 6 was not a decision he had made the previous evening, but a condition he had found himself in when the sleeping he had been attempting in his bedroom had declined to occur, and the not sleeping had continued long enough to reach a point at which he determined that being horizontal in the dark without sleeping was a less efficient use of his time than being at his desk without sleeping. He had been looking at Anna Reeve's public information for 3 hours before he arrived at his desk, which meant he had been looking at it since approximately 3 in the morning, which was when the not sleeping had produced enough frustration that he had picked up his phone and begun doing the thing he always did when confronted with incomplete information, which was to attempt to complete it. The public information was not incomplete in the ordinary sense. There was a significant amount of it, organized across the categories that the public information of people of her family's standing was organized across, which was news coverage of the professional kind, announcements of organizational appointments and charitable affiliations, and the kind of civic presence that translated into the kind of coverage that was not intrusive but was comprehensive and was filed in archives. He had read most of it by the time he arrived at his desk, and had arrived at a picture that was accurate in its facts and insufficient in its meaning, which was the characteristic failing of public information about people who were good at managing it. What the public information told him was this: she was 28 years old. She had been educated at the specific institutions that people of her family's standing were educated at. She had been working at Reeve Holdings for 3 years in a role that was described in the public documents as Strategic Investment Review, which was a title that could have meant many things, and in the context of Reeve Holdings probably meant the specific thing it said, because Reeve Holdings was not a company that maintained the kind of organizational structure that distributed titles for the purpose of appearance. Her father, David Reeve, was the founder and chief executive of Reeve Holdings, which was a company that had been operating for 31 years, and that had the particular quality of companies that had operated for 31 years under the same leadership, which was that it had the personality of its founder, without the person who noticed this having to look very hard to see it. The personality of Reeve Holdings, as visible in its public documents and in the specific pattern of its financial decisions over 31 years, was the personality of an organization that moved carefully and thoroughly, and that was in the specific business of knowing things about the things it was considering, and knowing them thoroughly before it made decisions about them. What the public information did not tell him, and what was the thing he needed to know in order to understand the size of the situation he was in, was why Anna Reeve had been at the Harrington party in clothes that were not the clothes of the Harrington party, talking to Thomas Reeve, standing near the corridor that led to the private wing of the house. He had questions about all 3 of these things, and he had answers to none of them that were sufficient, and the insufficiency was the thing that kept him at his desk at 6 in the morning on a Friday, looking at the screen rather than doing any of the things his desk and the Friday required. He had, by the time the morning had progressed to a point where the rest of the building began to populate around him, constructed several possible explanations for the 3 things, and had assessed them, and had rejected most of them on grounds of internal inconsistency. The explanation that remained after the assessment and rejection process was the explanation that he liked least, which was also, in his experience, the correct explanation when the assessment and rejection process was functioning properly, which was that she had been at the Harrington party not because she had arrived there through the social network that people arrived at the Harrington party through, but because she had chosen to be at the Harrington party, and that the choice had been made in connection with something that was not social in nature. The something that was not social in nature was connected to Thomas Reeve. Because Thomas Reeve was the thread that connected her to the Harrington party, in a non-social way that made sense, and the something it was connected to through Thomas Reeve was connected to Reeve Holdings and to the specific function that Thomas Reeve served in the relationship between Reeve Holdings and the financial structures that Reeve Holdings had interests in, and the specific structures that Reeve Holdings had interests in that were also the structures that Gideon Slate's organization had interests in were the structures he least wanted her to be reviewing at the moment she was standing in the room where he had done what he had done. The size of the situation, having been assessed, was significant. He sat with the significant size of it for approximately 40 minutes at his desk on the Friday morning, and then he made a decision about what to do with the significant size, which was to do what he always did when a situation was significant, which was to address it rather than wait for it to address him. He composed a message and sent it through the channel that connected him to Thomas Reeve. Because Thomas Reeve was the only available connection to Anna Reeve that he currently had access to, and the message asked whether it was possible to arrange a meeting, and the message was as brief and direct as the channel required and as he was capable of being when directness was the appropriate mode. The message sat without response for 7 hours, which was longer than messages to Thomas Reeve usually sat without response, which told him something about the nature of the 7 hours and about what Thomas Reeve was doing or being told to do or doing in consultation with someone else during them. He spent the 7 hours doing the things the Friday required and doing them with the quality of attention he brought to things that required it, while also maintaining the separate and parallel awareness of the message sitting without response that was the texture of the day underneath the business of it. The response, when it arrived at 4 in the afternoon, was from Thomas Reeve, and it said that he would pass the request along and that he did not think it was his place to say what the response would be or when, and that was the totality of the response. And the totality was more than some responses he had received in similar situations and less than he had needed, but it was what it was and what it was meant that the message had been passed along, which meant that she was aware that he had reached out, which meant the situation was in the category of situations that were moving rather than static, and a situation that was moving was one he was more comfortable with than a situation that was static. He left his desk at 6 in the evening and drove home and ate something and sat in the room in his house that he used when he needed to think, which was a room that was not an office and that had no screens in it, which was a condition he had established for it specifically, because his experience was that the rooms with screens did not produce the kind of thinking that needed to happen in the rooms without screens. He sat in the room and thought about 3 things. He thought about the public information about Anna Reeve and what it meant in the context of what he now understood about why she had been at the Harrington party. He thought about the specific financial structures that connected Reeve Holdings and his organization and what he knew about the status of those structures and what he did not know about their status. And he thought about 8 seconds, which he had been thinking about in the specific peripheral way that things sat at the edge of attention when the attention was not ready to address them directly, and in the room without screens, he addressed them directly. 8 seconds was the length of time it took to make a decision of the kind she had made. He had been in rooms where decisions were made under pressure for 15 years, and he understood the relationship between the amount of time available and the quality of the decision it was possible to make in that time, and what he understood about 8 seconds, and the decision that had been made in them was that the decision was not a simple one and had not been made simply. It had been made by a person who was processing the situation accurately and completely and without the contamination of emotional reaction, and the processing had produced a decision that was strategically significant rather than instinctive, and the strategic significance of the decision was that it had put her in a position of complete advantage in every category that was available to measure, without her having moved a step or said a word. He sat in the room without screens for 2 hours and thought about these things, and at the end of the 2 hours he had arrived at a picture that was more complete than the picture he had arrived at his desk in the morning, and the picture that was more complete was not more comfortable than the picture it had replaced, but it was more accurate, and accuracy was what he needed regardless of comfort. The picture was this. Anna Reeve had come to the Harrington party to observe the environment that Reeve Holdings was considering in relation to its financial entanglements, and what she had observed included him, and what she had observed had produced in her a significant amount of information, and what she was going to do with the information was what the next period was going to determine, and the next period was not under his control, which was the specific discomfort of the picture. He was not a person who had many experiences of the next period not being under his control. The experiences he had had of that kind were the experiences that had taught him the most, and that he had liked the least while the learning was happening, and the resemblance of the current situation to those experiences was something he noticed and did not find reassuring. He sat in the room without screens until approximately 10 in the evening, and then he went to bed and made another attempt at sleeping, and this attempt was more successful than the previous nights. Not because the situation had improved, but because the thinking had been completed, and completed thinking, in his experience, was the prerequisite for sleep, and the thinking was completed, and the sleep arrived. In the morning there was still no further response from Anna Reeve. There was not a further response on Saturday or on Sunday or on Monday. The absence of a response was not itself a response, but it had the quality of things that were not responses, and were something nonetheless, something that occupied the space where a response would have been, and that occupied it with a specific weight. He continued doing the things that each day required, and continued carrying the weight of the space where the response would have been alongside the things each day required, and the carrying was something he had not anticipated needing to do and was doing anyway, which was itself new information about the situation. If he had been in a position to collect information about his own condition, which was not his usual mode of operation but which the situation appeared to be requiring of him, whether he had intended it to or not. The response arrived on the 10th day after the Harrington party, on a Tuesday, through Thomas Reeve, in the form of an address and a time and the word confirmed, which was the totality of it. No preamble and no conditions and no indication of what the meeting would contain, only the address and the time and the confirmed, and he read the message once, and then read it again, and then set the phone down, and sat with the 3 pieces of information in the way he sat with information that was important, which was to give it the space it needed to settle into the correct position before acting on it. The address was the Reeve Holdings building in the financial district. He had driven past it many times and had looked at it from the outside in the way that he looked at buildings that were part of his understanding of the city's financial landscape without having had occasion to enter it. The time was 10 in the morning on the following Thursday, which gave him 36 hours, which was not a coincidence, which was the specific amount of time that allowed for preparation without allowing for so much preparation that the preparation became a different kind of performance from the one that was required. He spent the 36 hours doing what he usually did before meetings that mattered, which was to prepare without over-preparing, to have sufficient information to not be surprised by things that were available to know in advance, and to leave the space available for the things that were not available to know in advance, and that the meeting itself would provide. He reviewed what he knew about Reeve Holdings and what he knew about the specific financial structures that connected his organization to it. He reviewed what he had learned in the 10 days about Anna Reeve and her specific role at the company and the specific nature of the work she did there. He reviewed the landscape of his organization's financial entanglements and thought about which of them were visible to someone conducting a review and which were not, and what the distinction meant for what she might already know. The building, when he entered it on the Thursday morning, had the quality of buildings that had been built at a time when financial institutions understood themselves as civic presences rather than as service providers, which was to say, it had permanence in its materials and proportion in its design, and the specific gravity of things that had been built to last and had lasted. He told the person at the desk his name, and his name produced the specific kind of reception that names produced when they had been expected, which was efficient and unhurried, and he was directed to an elevator, and given a floor number and was not accompanied, which he understood as the kind of hospitality that was designed for people who were capable of making their own way to a floor in a building. The floor was not the top floor, which he had noticed, which told him something about the interior hierarchy of the building and about where Anna Reeve's office was positioned within it. The elevator opened onto a corridor that had the quality of working spaces rather than reception spaces, which was to say it had the organized and purposeful character of a place where people were doing things rather than the curated character of a place where people were seen doing things, and the distinction was one of the first things he registered about the building, and that he noted because it was the kind of building that was consistent with the public information about Reeve Holdings and the public information about David Reeve's approach to organizations. He was shown into an office that was medium in size, which was to say, neither the size of an office that was designed to impress, nor the size of an office that was designed to signal modesty, but the size of an office that had been assigned because it was the size that was appropriate to the function, and the function was visible in the room, which had the organized and working character of the corridor, but applied to a specific person's specific way of working, and the specific way of working was visible in how things were arranged, in the way that documents were organized, and the way that the desk was positioned relative to the windows, and the way that the room had been arranged around what it needed to accomplish, rather than around what it needed to appear to accomplish. She was seated at the desk when he was shown in, and she did not stand when he entered, which was a choice and not an oversight, and the choice said the same thing that the address had said, which was that the parameters of the meeting were established, and the establishing had been done in advance. He took the chair across from the desk, the chair that had been positioned for a visitor, and he sat in it, and she looked at him from the desk, and what was on her face was neither the expression from the Harrington party nor its absence, but something that was neither of those things, which was the expression of a person who was present in a professional capacity and was present fully and without performance. He had prepared several versions of what he was going to say. He had prepared them over 36 hours with the care he applied to things that required care, and he had prepared them with the understanding that multiple versions were necessary, because the version that was appropriate would depend on what the room contained when he arrived in it. And the room now contained information he had prepared for, and he selected the version that was appropriate to the room. The version he selected was the one he had identified as the most honest, which was also the most difficult, and he said it. He said what had happened at the Harrington party and why it had happened, not in the language that he had available for saying these things, which was the language of operational error and pattern reading failure, but in the language that the room required, which was simpler and less organized and less protected by the vocabulary of his usual modes of self-presentation. He said that he had acted on an assessment that was wrong, that the wrongness was not a justification for the action but was the accurate description of the mechanism that had produced it, that he had spent 10 days with the accurate description and with everything it said about him and about the habits of mind that had produced the assessment, and that what he was doing now was the thing that the 10 days had required him to do, which was to say what he had said in this room to her. She listened to all of this. The listening had the quality he had read in her at the Harrington party, the specific quality of a person who was processing rather than receiving, who was extracting information from what was being said rather than simply being present for the saying of it, and the extraction was happening in real time and was producing something that was visible in the careful and unhurried way that she sat through the duration of what he said. When he finished, there was a pause. That was the kind of pause that occurred when the person listening had been tracking multiple things simultaneously and was now giving each of them the time it needed to arrive at its appropriate position. He sat in the pause and did not fill it, which was something he had learned to do in rooms where he was not the one who had the most information, and in this room he was not the one who had the most information, and the sitting in the pause was the correct response to not being the one with the most information.
I understand what you have said and I accept it as what it is, which is to say I accept it as complete within its own terms, without having yet decided whether its completeness within its own terms is sufficient for the terms that the meeting itself is about. And the distinction between those two things is the distinction between what you have addressed and what remains to be addressed. And what remains to be addressed is what I will say next.
She said the name of the first financial structure. She named it specifically, and then she named the second, and then the third, and she named them in an order that told him the order in which she had identified them, and which of them she had identified first, and the order told him something about how she had conducted the review and what she had looked at first, and what she had found most immediately visible, and the information about how she had conducted the review was information that added to the picture he was building in the room. She did not ask him questions about the three structures. She stated what she knew about them, which was precise and substantially accurate in ways that told him what sources she had used and what sources she had not, and the substantial accuracy was the kind that was the result not of luck or approximation but of method, and the method was the method of Reeve Holdings applied by the person who had David Reeve's approach to knowing things thoroughly before deciding things about them. He sat across the desk from her and listened to what she said about the three structures and thought about whether anything she was saying was wrong, and found that it was not wrong in any material way, and the not being wrong in any material way was a fact that he sat with, in the way he sat with facts that had multiple implications, slowly and without moving too quickly toward any single implication.
Reeve Holdings has determined, in the course of the review, that the involvement in the three structures is involvement that Reeve Holdings will be withdrawing from over a period of 180 days, which is the period required by the legal and financial mechanics of the withdrawal, and which has been communicated in writing to the relevant parties the previous week.
She said this with the specific matter-of-factness of someone who was reporting a decision that had already been made and documented and set in motion, and that was not under discussion, because decisions that had already been made and documented and set in motion were not discussions, they were facts, and facts were what they were. He received this information with the stillness that he had developed for receiving information that he had not known he would receive when he entered a room, which was a stillness that was not passivity but was the specific suspension of response that allowed the information to arrive completely before any response was formulated. The 180 days was not the information that froze him. The information that froze him was the thing she said after the 180 days, the thing that was stated with the same matter-of-factness, but that had a different quality from the statement about the three structures, because it was not a statement about a decision that had already been made.
The review of the remaining relationship between Reeve Holdings and the entities connected to your organization is ongoing and has not been concluded, and the conclusion of the review will be determined by the findings of the review rather than by external factors, which is the standard operating practice of Reeve Holdings in all its reviews.
And she said this with the specific precision that told him that the external factors she meant was the thing that had happened at the Harrington party, which was something the review would note but would not allow to determine its conclusion, because the review was a financial and strategic assessment, and the thing at the Harrington party was a different category of thing entirely, and the categories were being kept separate, because the categories were, in fact, separate, and the keeping of them separate was not a concession but an accuracy. He sat in the chair across the desk and looked at her across the desk and thought about 8 seconds at the Harrington party and about the 8 seconds he was currently in, which were the 8 seconds of understanding what she had just done, which was to separate the personal from the professional in a way that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but something that existed outside both of those categories, in the category of a person who had a clear view of what things were and was applying that clear view to the situation without distortion in either direction. He had been in many rooms with many people and had seen many people apply many kinds of intelligence to many kinds of situations, and what he was seeing across this desk was the kind that was the rarest, which was the kind that was complete and consistent, and that did not require the situation to be different from what it was in order to function. The meeting concluded in the way that meetings with this character concluded, which was with the business that the meeting was for having been addressed, and with nothing that was beyond the scope of the meeting having been introduced, because the business that the meeting was for was sufficient and the scope was appropriate and the conclusion was the conclusion that the meeting's structure had been pointing toward from the beginning. He stood and she stood, and they conducted the brief and specific exchange that concluded a meeting of this kind, and he left the office and walked down the corridor and took the elevator and walked through the lobby and went out into the November afternoon, which had the particular quality of November afternoons in the financial district, which was the quality of a day that was serious about itself. He sat in his car for a while before he told the driver where to go. He sat the way he had sat in the car outside the Harrington house, with the quality of a person who had received more information than the visit had been expected to contain, and who was in the process of adjusting to the larger picture the additional information had produced. The adjustment, in this case, was of a different character from the adjustment at the Harrington house, because the adjustment at the Harrington house had been the adjustment of understanding the size of what he had done, and the adjustment now was the adjustment of understanding the size of what it was possible to do next, and the distinction between those two directions was the distinction between a situation that was closing and a situation that was, however incompletely and however contingently, open. The 180 days were not all the same. This was something he understood in the abstract before they began and understood specifically while they were occurring, which was the specific difference between abstract and specific understanding that the 180 days kept producing in him, the conversion of general knowledge into particular experience. He had known, in the abstract, that a period of significant organizational change was a period of uneven progress, that the pace of change was not constant, and that the resistance to it was not uniformly distributed, and that the days in which things moved forward were interspersed with days in which things moved sideways, and days in which things appeared not to move at all. He had known this. He had managed change before, had managed it in several phases of the organization's development, had managed it without the specific architecture of the 180 days, and without the specific person who had identified the three structures. What he understood specifically, which was different from what he had understood in the abstract, was this. The three structures that Anna Reeve had named in her office on the Thursday in November were three structures that he could not, once she had named them, see in any other way than the way she had described them. He had managed them for years in the vocabulary he had developed for them, the organizational vocabulary that was the vocabulary of someone who had built something from nothing, and who had learned, in the building, to call things by the names that were available rather than the names that were accurate, because the available names were the names that allowed the building to continue, and the accurate names were the names that were dangerous in specific ways that the building could not afford early in its life. The building had continued and was no longer early in its life, and the accurate names were now available to him, and what Anna Reeve had done in her office on the Thursday in November was to name three things by their accurate names in front of him, and once things were named by their accurate names in front of you, they could not be named by the available names again without you knowing you were doing it. He changed the three structures because they needed to be changed, and because he now knew they needed to be changed in a way that he had not known before, and the changing took the 180 days and took them fully, and on the 180th day, the legal and financial mechanics of the changes were complete in the technical sense, which was to say they were complete in the way that things were complete when the paperwork that recorded them was signed, and the signed paperwork was not the completion of the things themselves, which continued to be rebuilt in the days after the 180th day, but it was the completion of the period that had been named. The review of the remaining relationship between Reeve Holdings and his organization was also not complete at the end of the 180 days, which he knew because he had been informed of the review's status at regular intervals through Thomas Reeve, and because the nature of Reeve Holdings' reviews was the nature he had now spent significant time understanding, which was that they concluded when they concluded, and not at any external deadline. He had been asked, on 2 occasions during the 180 days, to provide additional information about specific aspects of the organization's financial structure, and he had provided it in both cases, completely and accurately, and without the redactions he would have made to the same information if the same request had come from any other source, because the person making the request was the same person who had named the 3 structures by their accurate names, and whose assessment of any information he provided would be an accurate assessment, and there was no available benefit in providing incomplete information to a person whose assessment would be accurate. He saw her twice during the 180 days. The first time was at a meeting that was arranged for the specific purpose of the review, organized through Anna Reeve, in the same office, in the same building, and the meeting had the same character as the first meeting, which was the character of a professional meeting conducted with professional precision and without anything that was not relevant to the professional purpose being introduced into it. He left the meeting knowing more about what the review had found in the period since November than he had known before the meeting, and with the additional understanding that what the review had found in the period since November was being received with the same organized and precise attention that the November meeting had applied to the initial findings. The second time he saw her was not arranged, and was not in either of their offices or buildings, and was not in a space that had the character of a professional setting, because the second time was at a conference that was attended by the specific intersection of people who occupied the overlap between the financial world and the organized world that he moved between, and she was at the conference in the specific capacity of Reeve Holdings' representative in the review capacity, and he was at the conference in the specific capacity of someone whose organization intersected with the financial world. And the conference was the kind of space where these 2 kinds of people were sometimes in the same room. She saw him across the room, and he saw her across the room, and neither of them moved toward the other immediately, which was the correct response to seeing someone across a room in a professional setting when the professional relationship between you was ongoing and the context of the room was not the context of the relationship. They were in the same conversations for part of the conference's program and in different conversations for part of it, and at the end of the day, when the program was over and the space was moving from program space to social space, and people were redistributing themselves in the way that people redistributed themselves in the transition between program and social, he found himself near her in the redistributing, near enough for the kind of conversation that the redistributing made available, but not so near that the conversation was required. She said something about the conference, something that was both professional and not only professional, the kind of remark that was appropriate to the space, and that contained in it the beginning of a register that was different from the review meetings, and that was different from the Harrington party, a register that he did not yet have a complete name for, but that he understood as the register in which things that were not yet anything might be beginning. He said something back in the same register, and what he said was both accurate and not the fullest version of what was accurate, because the fullest version of what was accurate was not what the beginning of a register called for. The beginning called for something that was pointing toward the fullest version, rather than containing it. The conference ended, and they went in different directions, and the next period began, which was the period after the 180 days, and after the 2 meetings, and after the conference. The period in which the review was still ongoing, and the changes were still being rebuilt, and the register that had begun at the end of the conference was somewhere between having begun and having become anything, which was the specific location of things that were in the process of becoming. He called her on a Tuesday morning approximately 3 weeks after the conference, not through Anna Reeve and not in relation to the review and not with a prepared purpose that was organizational in character. He called the number that she had provided at the end of the second review meeting, which was the number she had provided along with the other contact information that the meeting had required her to provide, and that he had noted and not used for the purpose it was provided for, and had now been sitting with for the period since the second review meeting, the period in which it had been available without being the correct thing to use, and then the period after the conference in which the question of whether it was the correct thing to use had been the question he had been sitting with. She answered on the third ring. The answering had the character of someone who had seen the number and made a decision about the answering before the third ring, because a person who had not made a decision before the third ring was a person who answered on the fourth or the fifth, and she was not that kind of person in any of the ways that he had come to understand as characteristic. He said her name when she answered, not with uncertainty and not as a question, and then he said that he was not calling about the review, and that he had been aware that the previous appropriate time to call for the purpose he was calling for was not yet, and that he had been waiting for the appropriate time, and that he was now calling because he had concluded that the time was now appropriate.
I understand what you are saying. I would have appreciated knowing you had made this assessment of the timing. Your assessment and my own assessment of the timing are in approximate agreement, and approximate agreement on timing is, in my experience, as good as agreements on timing generally get, because timing is not a thing that two people can ever be in perfect agreement about, only approximate agreement, and approximate is sufficient.
He sat with that for a moment and thought about 8 seconds at the Harrington party, and about 10 days of silence, and about 36 hours of preparation, and about 180 days of change, and about a conference and a register that had begun, and about a Tuesday morning call, and he thought about the specific quality of approximate agreement, which was not certainty, and was not the absence of uncertainty, but was the specific thing that existed in the space where two people's separate and independently arrived at understandings happened to be pointing in the same direction, and he thought that the specific thing that existed in that space was the thing that most of the things worth doing began in. Not in certainty, but in approximate agreement, and that approximate agreement was what they had, and that it was, as she had said, sufficient.